Around 2 weeks ago, there was a highly anticipated debate between the Catholic apologist Voice of Reason and the Eastern Orthodox apologist Petrus. This debate surrounded what are called the marks or notes of the Church. On the one hand, it was the task of Petrus to argue that the Orthodox Church uniquely possessed the notes of unity, Catholicity, apostolicity, and holiness that are outlined in the Nicene Creed. On the other hand, it was the task of Voice of Reason to argue that the Orthodox Church did not uniquely possess these notes. The methods of each of the debaters were clear. On the one hand, Petrus's argument was concerned with setting a minimum bar. Simply, he wanted to show that the early church lacked unity on many points in their various different disagreements, and same with Catholicity and their lack of numbers at certain points and lack of geographical extension at other points, especially compared to certain groups like the Arians. On the other hand, Voice of Reason pointed to the relative domination of Catholicism over every other Christian group, both geographically and numerically, along with the disunity that was present in Eastern Orthodoxy. While it is clear that each of these debaters have their points, it is equally clear that each side also presented fatal flaws that don't really lead to a satisfying conclusion in the framework that they presented. When it comes to the argument from Petrus, I believe that the bewilderment of many is best summed up by a message that was sent to me by a friend about the debate. Quote, "You can literally say the ancient church of the East, that is, the Nestorian church, is the true church by his argument." End quote. By Ubi's understanding of the marks, they are not marks. The purpose of the marks is being able to positively distinguish the church from false and heretical sects. Yet, in his presentation, it is impossible to see why the Nestorian Church of the East, or the Anglican Church, or any number of other bodies do not present the unity and Catholicity necessary for the true church. Further, it is impossible to see how the Orthodox Church surpasses the unity and Catholicity of any other body, something that was emphasized over and over again by the fathers of the Church against heretical sects. So, Ubi is forced into the truly bizarre position of simply reducing the Catholicity of the Church into a statement of doctrinal orthodoxy, and the unity of the Church into the simple presence of the sacrament of the Eucharist. This pressed many into the side of Voice of Reason, yet many of his statements were rightly seen as unsatisfactory as well, and Ubi was able to secure a rhetorical victory because of this, one which I believe was well executed. If Voice of Reason was to suppose that Catholicity meant the relative geographical and popular victory of one sect over another, how are we to deal with problems that immediately arise both when considering the history of the undivided Church and the history of Latin Catholicism in particular? Were there not times when the undivided Church found itself almost dwarfed by certain heretical sects and schismatic groups? Or at the very least, weren't there times when such a victory was not evident? Now then, is this supposed to be a note, something unique to the Church? Further, isn't the totalizing and evident geographical and numerical victory of the Catholic Church something that is only unique in the last few centuries, especially in the founding of the New World? Beside this, what are we to make of Voice of Reason's claims concerning unity? If we were to point out disagreements within Orthodoxy over something like the canon of Scripture, can Orthodox point to certain groups within pre-Tridentine Catholicism as similar evidence? Further, who are we to say which issues are and aren't dividing? In Catholicism, don't we have multiple schools of thought that are supposed to be able to unite together on certain essentials such as Scotus and Thomas? Why can't Orthodoxy have the same? This is not to even get into the questions of schism that have appeared from time to time in the history of the Church. Some may be tempted to respond to each one of these claims in favor of Catholicism by showing that the accounts of relative numerical and geographical victory of non-Catholic groups are historically inaccurate, or that there are unique differences in the disagreements within Orthodoxy that may merit a different judgment as to its effects on unity. One of the best examples of this has to do with the over-exaggeration of Arian influence that many are wont to make, claiming a dwarfing of the Nicenes by the Arians, often pointing to St. Jerome's statement that, quote, "the whole world groaned and marveled to find itself Arian." Yet the use of this quote to support the claim that the majority of bishops became Arian is quite dubious, as is evident from what St. Jerome goes on to say, quote, "The bishops came together who, having been tricked by the Arminian deceits, proceeded without a heretical intention, bearing witness to the body of the Lord, and whatever is holy in the Church, being aware of nothing evil in their faith. We thought," they said, "that the meaning agreed with the words, nor did we think that in the Church of God, where there is simplicity, where there is pure confession, that one thing could be hidden in the heart, while something else is spoken with the lips. A good estimation about evil persons deceived us. We priests of Christ had no thought of fighting against Christ." End quote. In fact, St. Jerome only claims that, quote, "a few of the bishops tricked into signing the creed went on to defend their error." Ironically, Ubi and others using this argument are using his words to support a claim that he was in the midst of refuting. Anyways, I digress. As much value as each of these individual discussions can have, it still does not get into the heart of the problem, which I believe is a set of faulty assumptions about what the Catholic Church teaches about the notes. In this video, I don't seek to provide some sort of exhaustive overview of individual facts, or the teaching of particular fathers, scripture, etc. Rather, I simply want to serve the truth by giving an overview and explanation of some distinctions made by theologians that are able to helpfully explain with more precision what is meant by the Church when she uniquely claims to be one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. This teaching faithfully reproduces the teaching of sacred scripture and the Holy Fathers, and is able to make sense of many of the difficulties that arise when we make such a claim about the true Church. First, I want you to think about the mark of holiness. It is said that the Church is holy. This is a property and necessarily exists in the Church according to Catholic dogma. Further, we understand that the Church is the congregation of the faithful. Yet, look around you. Is anyone so insane to say that there is some sort of unique degree of holiness present in your average Catholic? What do we make of the large number of saints who decry the general immorality of Catholics and the lukewarmness and faithlessness present among many within the Church? How can we, without dishonesty, claim that there is such a thing as the mark of holiness which the Church possesses? Well, if we were going to claim that holiness somehow means that the majority of people in the Church are holy, then we would look quite foolish. But the claim is not that the holiness of the Church is necessary in act. Rather, we claim that it is present in principle. What is this distinction? The distinction is between possessing what is able to cause something versus actually possessing that something. So when we claim that the Church is the mark of holiness, we truly claim that the Church is the font and source of holiness, providing in her teaching and through her sacraments the grace that is able to make holy those who worthily partake of them. At certain times, men within the Church refuse to make right use of these means and tools, and therefore holiness stagnates, many living in mortal sin. But this does not stop the Church from constantly possessing that note of holiness, which offers unto men the principles that are able to bring about not only ordinary holiness, but even heroic degrees of holiness. At certain times, many men partake of these means, and the presence of the mark of holiness becomes more and more manifest to everyone around, not only in the great number of saints in the presence of institutes of perfection, but also in the normal rejection of mortal sin present among the generality of the faithful. Yet at other times, the vast majority abandons these means, sinking into mortal sin. This obscures the holiness of the Church, but never takes it away, since the font of holiness is always present. Therefore, historically, when Catholic theologians treated this issue, they pointed to various different manifestations of holiness. For example, the manuals will often bring up the process of beatification and canonization. Yet are we to believe that the Church having the mark of holiness is dependent on these things? If the Church did not have such a formal process of beatification and canonization, would this mean that the Church is not holy? Of course not. Rather, these are signs and manifestations of the holiness of the Church. In relation to a different note, we can look at unity. Unity is often proven from the unified law that the Church is under due to the universal code of canon law. Yet are we to believe that the mark of unity was not present before the promulgation of the code in 1917? No, of course not. Various different signs and manifestations of the notes may come and go, obscuring and showing forth clearly the presence of the notes. But we must always refuse to identify the manifestation of something with the thing itself. Therefore, first, we must keep in mind that by note, we often simply mean to highlight the presence of something in principle in the various institutions, endowments, structures, and gifts of the Church, rather than some sort of immutable outward expression of that thing. Yet at this point, an obvious objection might arise within you, a tension that pervaded the debate between Ubi and Voice of Reason. This objection can best be illustrated by a consideration of unity. As we know from reality, unity follows upon being. To the degree that something exists, that thing has some degree of unity. There is never a complete lack of unity. Therefore, if we look at every group, from Mormonism to Sunni Islam to Eastern Orthodoxy to Redeemed Zoomer's Church, and everything in between, there is some sense in which we can speak of that body as unified. And conversely, there is also another sense in which the body is not unified. This applies to Catholicism as well. The same problems pervade the other notes. We can look at certain groups and see certain upstanding men. Further, we can see that there are many groups with apostolic lineage. Beside this, we can see that there are many groups with wide geographical dispersion in large numbers. So here we are forced to make a second distinction that can helpfully highlight the precise sense in which we speak of these notes. Here we can speak of the distinction between having a note and having an element. The note is something essential and following upon the very nature of something. The element is something accidental and partial, possessing a likeness but not the fullness of something. As an analogy, the distinction between a note and an element is like the distinction between the sense in which fire is hot and the sense in which water may be hot. Fire is, in a way, subsisting heat, and by its very nature hot, whereas, on the other hand, water is not properly hot. It only comes to it as some sort of accident from outside its essence. Similar analogies can be sought in the manner in which water is wet essentially and by its very nature, or light is bright essentially and by its very nature. In neither of these cases does it exclude certain partial and limited participations of wetness or brightness. The best analogy for this is found in the relationship of created perfections to God. Certain objects may be good or true or wise or whatever else, yet it is only God who is goodness, truth, and wisdom in a subsisting and essential manner. This is, for example, why Lumen Gentium speaks of the Church of Christ subsisting in the Roman Catholic Church. We see that there are certain elements of unity, sanctity, Catholicity, etc. in non-Catholic sects, yet such is not present as subsisting. Holiness gives us one of the best analogies for considering this point. Let's look at the Anglicans. Does their possession of certain elements of the traditional liturgy taken from Catholics cease to have some sanctifying effect simply due to its possession by Anglicans? What about Baptists? Does their possession of part of Scripture cease to have its intrinsic ordering towards sanctity due to it being in Baptist hands? In either of these cases, we must say of course not, for these things, by their very nature, tend towards sanctity. Yet we're equally able to recognize that having parts of the liturgy of the Church is insufficient for holiness, if it is not paired with the moral, ascetical, mystical, and pastoral theology that is present in its fullness only in the Catholic Church. Further, we can concede the sanctifying nature of Scripture to the Baptists. Yet how is this to have its full effect if separated from both the practical methods of employing Scripture for sanctifying and the exegetical tradition of the Church, which expresses the scriptural texts in the fullness of their power to sanctify? Here we can consider a second distinction when considering the notes, a distinction between considering on the one hand an element of unity, holiness, Catholicity, or apostolicity, and on the other hand truly and properly having the notes of unity, holiness, Catholicity, and apostolicity. On a practical level, the questions that are asked in the apologetic encounter and the realization of the true and exclusive possession of the notes by the Roman Catholic Church becomes truly fruitful, practical, and sensible. Here I can give two examples of the type of questions that may push towards reflecting on this teaching. First, let's say that you wanted to talk to a Protestant about the mark of holiness. Rather than making the claim that there is no degree of sanctification that happens within Protestant sects, or that there are more pious people in Catholicism than Protestantism, you can ask a question like, does Protestantism produce saints? We can see and acknowledge that Protestantism produces many nice people and good citizens, but the morally necessary means of true sainthood are not present. There is not and will never be a Protestant St. John of the Cross, or a Protestant St. Bonaventure, or a Protestant St. Alphonsus, or a Protestant St. Ignatius. There are most likely good faith Protestants who are in a state of grace, but the development of grace in the mystical life is so tied to a large number of means present only in the Roman Catholic Church that it is unthinkable that this grace will flower forth into that sanctity that is called heroic holiness. There's much more to say on this point, but this sketches the outline of this type of conversation. Second, let's say you wanted to talk to an Orthodox Christian about the mark of unity. Rather than making the claim that the fact of disagreement constitutes a lack of unity, a more modest line of questioning can be followed that exposes the true nature of the notes. One can say that both Catholics and Orthodox have disagreements that endanger the unity that Christ willed for the Church. Yet, which body has those means and principles which are able to overcome these threats? Is it Orthodoxy or Catholicism? Of course, these threats can be dealt with in a number of ways and by a number of means. But where can we find such a plenitude of instruments that are universally able to overcome all such threats? Yet, of course, this is not to say that such means have always been and will always be used by the clerics within the Catholic Church in a proper way for overcoming these difficulties. Rather, this is a question about principles and means, which do not always show forth clearly. In both of these cases, I believe that we see a sensible, sober, and moderate treatment of this question, drawn from the greatest of our scholastic theologians who treated this question. Yet before I end this video, I wanted to deal with a possible objection that will be brought up. For many, they will say that this seems to be the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, but that it contradicts the preconciliar tradition. Yet such a claim is without a basis in reality, which I can show with a set of quotes before I end this video. Beside the two quotes that it will follow, Father Martin Jugi also wrote about this, among other authors. First, J. Urban, writing in the year 1907, wrote, quote, "Among Christian communities, scarcely any society can be found whose faithful do not belong to the true church in some degree, at least as to its members, and consequently also participate to some extent in the various marks of the true church. And the more bonds, whether internal or external, by which heterodox individuals are united to the true church, the more fully they are said to participate in a greater number of the church's marks. Consequently, the apologetic value of the marks in refuting such communities diminishes in proportion to the fewer internal or external bonds of the church that are lacking in them. Therefore, the chapter on the marks of the true church, especially in its application to the Eastern Church, seems to require some modification. Nothing compels us to deny the hierarchical apostolicity of the Eastern Church, since we recognize the validity of its episcopate. Nor does anything demand that we entirely strip it of the note of sanctity, since we acknowledge its sacraments to be truly effective and salvific, provided no subjective impediment is present. Without a doubt, a careful comparison of the fruitfulness of good works observable in the Roman Church and in other communities will provide some criterion for judging where grace is more abundant, a criterion which certainly requires much careful study. But to wholly deny sanctity to the Eastern Church, as is commonly done, for example, because of their supposed lack of saints, is not permissible, either a priori or a posteriori. Not a priori, as if from certain theological principles. For if the sacraments confer grace ex opere operato on those who do not voluntarily place an impediment, why should they not also be able to raise a person to a common, even greater degree of sanctity? Is the hand of the Lord shortened? Not a posteriori, as if from experience. For the Greek Church, and even more the Russian, has, after its separation from communion with Rome, produced and canonized an entire host of saints. And while it is not for me to affirm that all those canonized were truly saints, on the other hand, it would be to undermine the value of all human testimony if we were to wish to relegate all accounts of Eastern saints to the realm of fables, moved solely by the conviction that distinguished holiness of life is impossible among the heterodox. The difficulties that arise for anyone attempting to demonstrate through the note of Catholicity that the Roman Church and not the Greek is the true spouse of Christ would be too lengthy to pursue here. Even unity of both faith and governance is preserved to some degree in the Greek Church through its episcopal structure, though I readily concede that, due to the lack of further unity, the Easterners may be aptly challenged. And this necessity of social unity is the principal means by which Catholic apologists are furnished with not inconsiderable weapons against the Greeks. But this is nothing other than to demonstrate the divine institution of the primacy through the direct arguments, and not by reflecting on the four notes. To summarize my meaning in a few words, those who defend the Roman Church against the Eastern churches need not prove that the Greek or Russian Church possesses none of the essential properties of the spouse of Christ, and thus that the aforementioned churches are wholly deprived of the means necessary for salvation, since in reality these same churches, at least as particular churches, are united to Christ the head, and therefore also to the rest of the body of the Church, through the mystical bonds of the sacraments and the priesthood, and they participate in the marks of the true Church in proportion to their adherence to them, truly using the Catholic means that lead to salvation." End quote. Second, Joachim Salaveri, writing in the year 1955, answered the following objection. Quote, "The four properties of the Creed, although on a lower level, but certainly to some degree, are found also in the Eastern Orthodox Church and in the principal sects of Protestants, especially the Episcopalian." End quote. To this point, he offers a distinction, writing, quote, "Because they are found on a lower level in these churches, it is clear that they cannot designate these churches as true against the Catholic Church, conceded. And because in some way they are found in these churches, it must be granted that they participate in the properties of the true Church. I distinguish. They participate in the four properties of the Church in an essential manner that Christ will deny. They participate in the same properties in a measure fully insufficient, I subdistinguish. And this participation is to be attributed rather to the universal salvific will of God, and the exercise of the power of orders, which produces its effects ex opere operato, even if the minister and the recipient are not members of the true church, conceded. And this participation is to be attributed to the same churches in such a way that they can say it is proper to themselves, and not rather borrowed, as we have said, from the true church, denied. End quote. In conclusion, it is clear that we must be excessively careful when discussing the marks of the church, in order to not fall into a one-sided and unrealistic treatment of the question that is almost entirely devoid of apologetic value. Here it is helpful to keep in mind the distinctions made classically by the theologians of the church when writing on the question. That's all that I have for you, and as always, God bless.